Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Josephine Watson, Commercial Projects Editor at IGB, and I'll be chairing today's IGB webinar. We are delighted to be hosting a webinar with TransUnion today, discussing assessing the total cost of fraud in your fraud prevention strategy. As operators and platforms transform to meet shifting consumer behaviour and new fraud patterns arise in digital channels, it's never been more important to understand and assess a comprehensive financial impact of your fraud solutions. So, in today's webinar, we'll be discussing how to optimise your fraud payment investments, understand how to calculate the costs of fraud, and implement effective solutions for fraud detection and prevention. We're joined today by Angie White, Product Marketing Manager at TransUnion, and there will be a Q&A following the presentation. We advise that you all submit questions as we go along, and we'll try to address as many of them as possible in the allocated time. With that said and done, I'm going to pass over to the lovely Angie.
Thank you for that introduction, Josephine. I appreciate it. So I'm really excited to get the chance to talk with you all today. As Josephine mentioned, I work with TransUnion in our Global Fraud and Identity Solutions Group. So, this is definitely an area where, I have a keen interest, and something I definitely geek out about is ROI and looking at measures for, different fraud programs and how you can prove out that value. Just want to start by, talking through a lot of the content for this webinar is going to be based on one of Gartner's newest reports, which is entitled How to Create a Payment Fraud Detection Strategy at the Organizational Level. So I think Matt's going to go ahead and, or Josephine, I'm not sure who's going to do it, but they're going to go ahead and pop in a link in the chat for everybody so that you can download that for free. I would encourage you to go ahead and download that soon, because I believe it's only available through the end of December. I might be wrong on that. Don't quote me. But, a lot of great information on there. We're going to walk through today. One of the things that I'll point out right away is that, while this report specifically talks about payment fraud, I think a lot of these learnings, a lot of the methods that they use in here can be applied for different points of risk within your player journey. So we're going to talk through what some of those measures are and how you can apply that more broadly across your organization to really get a good feel for what is the total cost of fraud in your organization, and how can you use those measures to show ROI for your fraud group and show that value to the larger business. So some of the things we're going to discuss today, we're going to walk through how you develop that total cost of fraud model within your organization and align that with your organizational goals to determine what your tolerable fraud rates are. So, of course, there's always a balancing act there of what are those investments that you make in fraud prevention and what return does that bring back to the business. So we'll talk through some of those ways that you can get to what that kind of optimal point is. We'll then touch on how to optimize your investments for fraud detection and prevention and drive down that total cost of fraud. Next, we'll look at how you can work with cross-functional teams and identify their challenges and requirements across the organization. So, of course, we know that fraud touches many parts of your business, and there's going to be a lot of different requirements from different stakeholders. So how do you balance that? And then lastly, how you can implement solutions that address fraud challenges throughout the player journey. First off, I want to take a second to introduce TransUnion. So, a lot of you might be familiar with TransUnion as a credit reporting agency, but, we have a great set of solutions that are really focused on how you can make trust possible between businesses and consumers by providing a more accurate view of your customers, which is really important in today's digital economy. So TU provides some really unique capabilities to create and understand the digital identity of consumers. We provide this precision around the data identity and the insights we can deliver are essential in fighting fraud throughout all player interactions as you're interacting in these faceless channels. We have a really unique view of the consumer that is built on what we look at as 3 pillars. So the first being credit. That includes over 650 million consumer credit records worldwide. Non-credit or public records. With that, we have over 90,000 sources worldwide of public records, non-credit records. So just an astounding amount of information. And then, of course, digital. So when we're talking about digital records or digital data, a lot of that is referring to how your consumers interact with your business. So looking at the laptop they use, the smartphone that they're using to place a bet, there's a lot of information that can be garnered from those devices and used to protect your business against risk. So we use that experience where we've seen over 7 billion devices worldwide to understand what are those risk behaviors from devices. And really what's foundational to us, what's really important to us is making sure that we take all this data with a platform that's built to connect all these different sources while upholding the highest consumer privacy, security, and compliance requirement to ensure that all data is stewarded with care. Looking a little more specifically at iGaming, so we have a lot of experience within this space. We work with over 120 iGaming operators and platform providers worldwide. Something I just call out here is the 1.2 million reputation reports. So that's something that's unique to our system, where if an operator, they have a confirmed report of fraud, they can associate that with an account or a device, and then those fraud reports are used to stop fraud across our network. So a really great benefit of our system in being able to stop fraud that's moving from system to system. All right, so diving into the Gartner report, this is a graphic that we pulled directly from the report, which is really talking about how you can broaden your definition of what the total cost of fraud is. So it's a pretty simple calculation, really, but it goes beyond just looking at fraud losses, which is, I think, a way that a lot of fraud departments get siloed a lot of times. So it's also adding in, the cost of tools and headcount. It's also looking at the customer lifetime value. So first, just looking at the tools and headcount, there are a lot of efficiencies that can be gained by optimizing your fraud prevention strategy, even in areas of the business outside of the fraud team. So, like we talked about before, fraud impacts a lot of different areas of the business. A good example of that is like decreasing handle times in the call center. So your fraud prevention controls at login can either increase friction for good consumers or decrease friction, and that can have downstream effects such as increases in calls to the contact center. Another example is improving your onboarding experience by looking at real-time risk signals. So looking at those risk signals, you can decrease unnecessary manual reviews, unnecessary step-up challenges, to really create that risk-based approach where you're only adding friction where there is risk. And then, of course, looking at the lifetime value of your customer. I think fraud has a major impact here. So, if a player switches to another game because the onboarding process is too onerous or too difficult, or they get frustrated by the setup process, that's potential lifetime revenue that's been lost from that player. So it's just important to consider measures such as reduction in false positives and decreasing customer friction when you're determining the overall cost of your fraud prevention operation. All right, so we want to keep everybody awake here, and so we're going to do a quick little poll here. All right, looks like we have that popped up. So how do you currently calculate the total cost of fraud for your strategy? Do you just look at fraud losses currently? Maybe you look at fraud losses and also the cost of tools and headcount. Or maybe you're already dialed in with what Gartner's doing, looking at fraud losses, headcount, and customer lifetime value impact. Or maybe you use a different type of measurement. Or you could fall into the last bucket there where you don't currently have any type of measurement and you're starting, from the baseline, trying to get that in place. So we'll give everybody a few seconds here to go ahead and respond to the poll, and then we can share those results in real time. It'll give me just a second to take a swig of coffee here. All right, can we go ahead and share the results of the poll now? So I'm not seeing the results. Is that something you can share, Josephine?
Hi there, Angie. Yep, sure. So we had 19% say that fraud losses were how they calculated. 33% said fraud losses and tools and headcount. 10% said fraud losses, tools and headcount and customer lifetime value. 14% said other measurements, and 24% said they do not currently do any fraud cost measurements. I'll also pop that in our private chat so you can refer back if you need to.
Great, thank you, Josephine. All right, so it seems like we have kind of a mix of responses there. So I think, there's definitely a lot of great information here that for wherever you're at in that journey of kind of getting those measurements in place in your own organization to be able to really understand the ROI of your fraud prevention program. I think there's a lot you can gather today. So this is another graphic that comes directly from the Gartner report, which I think it just really rung true for me. So if you look at this on the x-axis here, you have your fraud rate. So on the left, that's low. So that would, if you could get to a 0% fraud rate, that would be the very lowest, right? To high over on the right-hand side. And then on the y-axis there, you have your total cost of fraud. So, oops, got too eager there. All right, so look, what you're seeing here is that, you can get to a very low fraud rate. This is something we actually, often talk about with clients, with prospects. Yes, you could get to a 0% fraud rate, but it's not necessarily most beneficial for your business, right? You can get to a 0% fraud rate, but you're going to be adding a lot of customer friction. You're going to have to be adding a lot of different controls, a lot of investment in headcount and tools. So, while it would be great to be able to get to that 0% fraud rate, it's probably not realistic as far as the investment that would be required for that. Looking to the far right, you can loosen your controls to decrease friction for your consumers, but that's going to have the impact of driving up your fraud rate. So on the left, you're driving up your cost because you're increasing your cost of tools and headcount. On the far right, you're driving up the cost of your fraud losses. So really important to make those considerations for those different factors that are going into calculating your total cost of fraud, so you can get to that white slice in the middle there, the optimal zone. So that's where you're minimizing your fraud losses while also making the right investments in tools and headcount, and getting that right balance of friction versus security for the customer journey. And if there's more detail in the report, if you're looking at how you calculate that, I'm not going to go into that detail today, but just letting you know that that's a tool that's available to you. So as I mentioned, this is something, a methodology that we really feel can be used to calculate cost across the entire player life cycle. So, there's many points of risk throughout the player journey, from onboarding all the way to withdrawal. Just for the sake of time, we're going to focus on 2 today. So we're going to look at onboarding and account login. What are some of those levers that you can pull to drive more revenue, to increase the lifetime value of your customers, and ultimately improve that total cost of fraud within your organization. So first, we're going to look at account login. I think this is such an important area that can oftentimes be overlooked, so it's important to have the right controls in place so that you can secure player accounts but not add too much friction, because that can drive a lot of downstream cost. So just looking at it from a revenue perspective, sorry, let me take a step back real quick. So just looking at this chart, so the areas in blue, that's where we're looking at potential for driving increased revenue or increased profit margins. And then the areas in yellow are where we're looking at where you could take cost out of your business. So important to look at, both sides of that coin. On the revenue side, really improving that customer experience. So removing any friction at login. I shouldn't say removing any friction, providing the right amount of friction, right? Because you want to make sure that you're keeping out the bad actors while reducing challenges, reducing friction for your good customers. Decreasing account resets. So that has a number of impacts, right? If somebody has to, say, reach out to your contact center to reset access to their account, that's not a great customer experience. They're not going to be happy about that, and that's going to drive up a lot of costs for your business. We'll talk more specifically in just a moment here about, what are some of those costs that we see typically for a business. Then looking at revenue per customer, how can you, creating that better login experience, creating that smoother customer experience, really allows you to drive longer-term loyalty with customers, drive cross-selling opportunities, and also improve your promotion and or bonus targeting. So if you have a good sense of, yes, these are my good customers that are accessing their accounts, then you can more confidently offer promotions. We'll hit on that in a more detail here in a moment. As far as reducing costs, so one of the main risk factors we see at login is account takeover. So being able to reduce the types of fraud that you're seeing at login. Along with that, being able to reduce manual reviews. So if you have the right tools in place, if you're able to have more confidence in the decisions you're making, you can drive down costly manual reviews. Other operating efficiencies that you can gain are, reducing unnecessary step-ups, reducing account access issues in the call center. And this all, leads to higher throughput. So if you can optimize your contact center utilization, if you can expedite low-risk requests, that all creates greater efficiencies that increase your profit margin. As promised, we're looking at the cost for password resets within your call center. What we see is this can be really costly for businesses. On average, taking 10 minutes for a contact center agent to do a manual password reset. Of course, there's other types of fraud challenges that a lot of businesses encounter in the call center, but really just these password resets are a big cost driver. And I think the thing to keep in mind too is that it's a non-value add activity. So your customer doesn't want to have to be reaching out to the contact center. and it doesn't provide any value for your business. It's only costs. So really important to be able to manage those costs and bring them down. So this is a example. We actually have this in the handouts. It's the ID Vision case study, US Telecom. So you might be asking yourself, why are we talking about a telecom use case? Well, this one I think is so pertinent across really any industry that I thought I would share it with you here today. So this was one of a major US telecom provider in the US that was looking to improve the login experience for their customers. What they were running up against was that their previous authentication solution was causing a lot of customer friction. They were having a lot of false positives. They were having a lot of customers that were having to reach out to the contact center to get into their accounts. They actually even they saw an increase in customers just calling in to complain about their authentication. They felt it was so terrible. They were also seeing a big increase in account takeover. So this was actually a really interesting case where they were getting hit by what we term romance scams. So fraudsters were going to dating sites and ingratiating themselves with people and getting them to give them their login credentials so that they could go add a line of service, get a phone so that they could talk with their sweetheart. Well, instead they go and they add 10 lines of service and get 10 new phones. So this was something that was very costly for this telecom provider. I think an interesting corollary or a way that this might relate to iGaming is with account brokering. So we've definitely heard an uptick from our iGaming clients in the last couple of years of seeing these account brokering attacks where they'll have a fraudster, they come in, they set up an account, they get it to say VIP status, so it looks like a very trustworthy account, and then they sell it to money launderers or criminal organizations that use that to commit fraud. So, these same kind of controls could be used to see that, yes, while that player has the right, username and password, we can see that the device associated with that person logging in is not authorized for that account. So really powerful to be able to shut down those types of attacks where, either through phishing scams or romance scams, whatever tool they're using to get those legitimate user credentials, you can still shut down those ATO attacks. All right, sorry, that was a little divergent there, but so getting back to the case study here, some of the results they saw, they added device-based authentication at login, and what that did is it added a second factor of authentication using the user's device. So the consumer, they register that device to their account, and then you can check it the next time they come in to make sure, one, yes, this is a good trusted device that's been paired to the account, and two, are you seeing any risk signals associated with that account? Is there, are they using a Tor? Is there a geolocation mismatch? Anything like that would signal that you might want to do a manual review, do additional challenges, that there could be some risks there. So with this, they saw a big decrease in customer complaints about login, and a big decrease, more importantly, in the volume of calls they were getting to their contact center for account access reset. It also significantly reduced their account takeover. So a really big win here where they saw a lot of savings across a lot of different areas within their business. All right, so looking at onboarding, similar to what we were talking about with login, here in the blue, you have the areas where you have potential for increasing revenue and profit margin, and in yellow, cost reduction. So in the revenue area, here you're looking at conversions. So important as you're trying to attract new players, get them into the game, to be able to expedite that onboarding. Controls such as KYC, things like that, being able to do those checks in a way that is automated, that reduces friction where possible. That's going to result in higher pass-through rates, increase the speed to get players set up and get them betting and playing. Ultimately, very important for your business. Looking at the cost reduction, column here in the middle, this is where you can look at what types of fraud are going to happen at onboarding. So preventing new account fraud, decreasing bonus abuse. This is one that we see a lot of our operators are struggling with. It's something that we're hearing a lot in the market, where bonus abuse is just really rampant. It's one of the top types of abuse that we're seeing across the board. So such an important for operators to be able to use those incentives to attract new players, or to entice players back into the game, right? So being able to stop bonus abuse, that's going to be a big cost savings within your business. But more importantly too, it's also going to help you with attracting and retaining customers long term. So some of the operating efficiencies that can be gained here, optimizing your solutions, automating where possible for things such as identity verification or document verification. And then looking at your profit margins, just being able to get a higher throughput by those digital optimizations and agent utilizations. All right, we also have this case study in the handouts if you're interested. So this was an iGaming operator that we've worked with for years and years. They came to us because they were struggling with bonus abuse. So what they were seeing is they were offering really attractive new player incentives, but what they were finding was that fraudsters were going in and they were setting up hundreds of new accounts to exploit those incentives. So this was, there was real costs of each new player could win 5,000 euros or more. So there was those real costs that they lost those potential winnings. But they were also driving a lot of operational costs, right? So it was driving up the number of manual reviews that they were having to do and taking up a lot of time for the fraud team. So they implemented device-based intelligence. This allowed them to see the connections between new accounts and suspicious devices. So with this, basically, they were able to identify fraud rings that were coming in, setting up hundreds of new accounts to exploit their bonus program. And then by being able to see those linkages between devices and accounts, they were able to shut that down, which resulted in tens, if not hundreds of thousands of euros in lost bonuses that were saved. So really important to look at, where are those risks within, the different points of your player journey. How can you mitigate those risks in a way that, reduces friction for good customers and creates operational efficiencies throughout your organization. Okay, so this is actually something we developed at TransUnion to help our customers in determining ROI for their fraud programs. This is actually kind of a blend where we were looking at, it was a sports betting operator that was looking to improve their login flow and also fight fraud at new account setup. So what we see here is that for that top line there, improved conversions, they were seeing about a 22% abandonment rate. So looking at, how they could streamline their reviews, streamline that onboarding experience, estimated a 35% increase in conversions. And here at the bottom there, you can see that that was the average annual revenue per account. So that was the expected revenue that they would get from each of those new player accounts. And you can see how that all multiplies out there. So that resulted in expected revenue of 15.4 million, which comes out to about 770,000 in potential profit. Looking at fraud loss reduction, this is, they were experiencing a lot of account takeover. We're estimating 1% of accounts might be subject to account takeover, which falls within the range of what we typically see. Operators usually fall between 2 to 4% in the fraud rate. But each of those, that can be very costly to a business. This the $394. That actually came from Javelin, where that was the average cost that they saw for account takeover fraud losses. So we use that as the measurement there. So a potential savings there of 146 million. That's obviously going to vary, depending on what the dynamics are in your business, how much account takeover you're seeing, or what kind of fraud you're seeing at different points in the life cycle of your players. And then looking at the operating efficiencies, this is where, again, talking about the contact center, being able to optimize that login experience to drive down those reset costs within the contact center. So we've seen, estimates of $5 to $10 per call for account access reset. On top of that, a lot of organizations also have step-up authentication that they do in the contact center. So adding in that cost of one-time password or OTP, and then looking at how that nets out per month versus annually. So, when we looked at this all together, now you're starting to look at, your improved conversions, reducing your fraud rate, how you can get those operational efficiencies. And now you're painting a much broader picture of how your fraud prevention strategy can benefit your business. All right, so we have another little poll. Keep everybody awake here. So where are you currently seeing the most fraud within your organization? And this one, you can actually select multiple options. So is it at onboarding, at deposit, at play or bet, payment, or withdrawal? So we'll give everybody a few seconds here to respond to the poll, and then we'll share out in real time. All right, Josephine, do we have the results?
Yep, we're just closing the survey now. Cool, so 33% said onboarding, 29% said deposit, 57% said play and bet, 24% said payment, and 33% said withdrawal.
Great. Yeah, I think that definitely falls in line with what we've been hearing from our iGaming clients. So I think that just really goes to show that, there's risk at all these different points within the player's journey. So it's important to think through, what are those risks? How can you mitigate to protect your business? All right, so now moving on to how you can optimize fraud prevention with a cross-functional team. So I think, fraud is one of those parts of the organization that's really unique because it's hitting on a lot of different areas of the business. So, you have stakeholders across identity and access management, in infrastructure, cybersecurity, customer experience. So, you know, Gartner in the report, they go into a lot more in depth in this, but really it's important to be having those conversations with the constituents from all these different parts of the organization so that you can understand what are their challenges and requirements, and make sure that you're creating measures and input that takes those requirements into account. So here we just pulled out a few, and within the report, it gives them much more in depth for each of those different areas. But just looking at some of the different challenges that the fraud organization has to balance across the business. So, fraud analysts, data science, they're looking at managing disparate fraud management tools, a lack of transparency for machine learning models. They're looking at how they can centralize decision platforms, ingest data, and get to better decisions. In finance, they're looking at the overt cost of fraud losses and cost of fraud management tools. And so that's an area where it's really important to be able to demonstrate the ROI of fraud programs to the larger business, so that fraud doesn't become a silo or an island in and of itself. Growth in marketing, this is where a lot of times the incentive programs are being driven from the marketing department. They're also looking at brand reputation, things like that. So a real need to focus on that customer experience and make sure that any fraud that hits players is mitigated so that you're not damaging your brand. Legal and compliance, of course, there's a lot of different regulations that iGaming operators have to comply with depending on where you're at, looking at compliance with privacy regulations such as GDPR, PSD2, looking at, player self-exclusion and AML provisions. So really important to understand what are the requirements there and how can you ensure that your programs are upholding, consumer privacy and complying with all regulations. So really important to be considering what are those different challenges and requirements across the organization so that you can work together, make sure that the fraud team doesn't become a silo where you are only looking at the reduction in fraud losses, right? Because there's so many more ripple effects that go across the business as you're implementing your fraud protection programs. All right, so lastly, implementing solutions that help you optimize your total cost of fraud throughout the player journey. We have lots of information on this. I didn't want this to become a sales pitch, but I think one of the big things here is really looking at how you can balance the player experience and reducing risk. So being able to take those risk insights that you see so that you can have the right amount of friction, a friction right experience. And we see this, like even players, consumers, they want some friction in their journey because they want to know that you're protecting their accounts. They want to know that you're doing your due diligence to keep fraud out of the game. So having that friction right experience where you're protecting accounts, keeping out bad actors, but without adding unnecessary step-ups, without adding unnecessary friction. And I touched on some of this throughout, but really we see that as three main pillars here. So identity proofing, risk-based authentication, and fraud analytics. So really, as you're looking across the player journey at your different points of risk, you really are going to have to consider, what identity proofing measures do I need to put in place for onboarding new players? What authentication makes sense at login to stop attacks such as account takeover that don't detract from the player experience too much. And then, of course, fraud analytics, being able to look at fraud risk for transactions such as bonus abuse, things like that. So important to be able to prevent those attacks across the player journey. All right, and now I think we're going to open it up for questions.
Alrighty, thanks so much for that, Angie. A really fantastic presentation. Thanks to our audience for responding to the polls. And like Angie says, we have now got time for questions. You can submit these through the GoToWebinar portal. Please continue to send them through and we'll address as many as possible in the given time today. So first and foremost, we've got a question here. Can you help teams to quantify ROI? Is that part of your services that you're offering to operators here?
Yeah, we're always happy to work with any client, any prospect, if they want to, have help in walking through kind of the same analysis that we did with the sports betting operator, where we can look at, your transactions, what are some of the fraud challenges that you're having, where are you looking to optimize your processes, and what kind of savings could that bring to your business? Absolutely, we're happy to help with that.
Fantastic, thank you very much. The next one would be, what recommendations do you have for getting buy-in from different stakeholder groups?
That is a fantastic question. I think part of it is having that dialogue, right? So having those conversations with them to understand what their needs and their challenges are, and sharing out with them. A lot of them probably aren't as familiar with, fraud and how that has ripple effects across the organization. So just being that kind of trusted advisor and that champion within the organization, where you can show how, fraud impacts the customer experience, how it impacts operating efficiencies as you're having those conversations. And I think, with this methodology Gartner's laid out, just being able to demonstrate in numbers too, what those investments mean to your organization, I think is a really, really powerful tool.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Next question up, how do you account for combating evolving fraud tactics? Obviously, the fraudsters are often one step ahead. How do you sort of get ahead of them?
Yeah, I think, it's important to have a layered approach. So as you're looking at your different risk points, there's no silver bullet, right, that's going to protect the entire player journey and stop all fraud. You really need to look at, what are the individual risks at the different points in your player journey, and what controls can you layer in place so that if a fraudster is able to get in, say, log into an account, if they go to account management to try to reset, the email or phone number for a player, you have additional controls in place to stop them there. So I think just really kind of thinking through that layered approach of what are those risks, how can you mitigate?
Perfect. Another question, in your calculation of total fraud losses, do you include just known and detected fraud? Are you estimating fraud losses whether unknown or known?
Yeah, so I think you can do it either way. I mean, if you have a good feel for, what is the fraud in your organization, you can use those measurements. But if you feel like you have a lot of unknown fraud, you might want to look at, what is kind of the industry norms, what levels of fraud is the industry seeing, and use those measurements to get a more accurate picture.
Brilliant. It was also mentioned in the presentation a few times about other industries, other sort of auxiliary industries that iGaming can learn from. What have been some of your biggest things that you would say are transitory to this industry, and where have they come from?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that really stands out to me is, as we look at fraud, we see it crossing geographies, we see it crossing industries. Um, it really is important to think through, to have that intelligence that can be shared across multiple industries, because what we're seeing is that romance scam that started off on a dating site is now ending up in your customer's account being taken over. Or we've seen a really big increase in phishing scams in the last year due to COVID. So fraudsters are targeting consumers with these phishing scams and getting them to hand over their login credentials to accounts. So, what starts as a phishing scam, a COVID phishing scam aimed directly at a consumer, then ends up being account takeover within your business. So I think the takeaway I would have is that we really see that fraudsters are moving between industries. They're moving just where they see opportunity. So I wouldn't get too focused on just iGaming. I would, think through the broader picture of what's happening with fraud.
Brilliant. We don't have super loads of questions coming through from the audience, so I will do one last reminder for submission from the audience. I think one thing that's always interesting to ask people would be, what do you think is the one thing that people in this industry in particular need to understand better? If everyone was listening here today and you could give them one piece of information to take away specifically for iGaming, what would that be?
I would say, definitely thinking through, how you can demonstrate value within the organization. I think a lot of times we hear this all the time from fraud analysts, that fraud a lot of times ends up being very siloed, being an island within the organization. I think if you can demonstrate the wider value of your fraud program, you're going to get more buy-in, you're going to get more resources. So, that would be my takeaway, is that, really think through, how can you work with the different stakeholders within your business and show that value of the fraud prevention program to the business, not just from a fraud angle.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. We've got time for one last question that's come in from the audience just in the time of that last one, which was, what's the split between internal and external fraud?
Oh, that's a really good question. So you're saying like, I haven't specifically looked at that. We do have a group that looks at, insider threats. I think, you would, it's something you would need to look at within your own organization, where you're seeing that fraud. But yeah, no, that's a good question.
Brilliant. Well, if that is all from our audience, Honor, we have got one more, which is, what are the risk of account takeover exactly? With the control on WDs, the money is only going to be in the account owner, surely. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say there's a number of risks with account takeover. So it's not just, they could go in and drain the funds. In this particular instance, it sounds like they couldn't. But they could also, that's a common tactic for money laundering, where they'll take over an account and they use it to move money through. So it could be a problem for you for AML compliance. Sure.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for those answers. Guys, if you have any more questions, please do feel free to send them into info@igamingbusiness.com and we'll forward them over to iovation and make sure we get those answered for you. But other than that, I think that is everything for today. So for our audience, thank you for joining us. And to Angie, thank you very much for joining us today as well. Today's webinar has been recorded and will be available to listen to on demand shortly on igamingbusiness.com, where you can rewatch it and share with your colleagues. If you want to hear more from TransUnion, keep an eye out on IGB, as we have 2 upcoming sessions with them in January and February, as well as a few other bits of content that will be going up soon under our brand views and lightning talk sections. Otherwise, it's been lovely having you all, and we'll see you soon. Thanks all. Bye.